If you pull up GTO Wizard and look at buttons response versus a small blind 3-bet, it actually recommends 4-bet jamming with Queen Jack suited. So what's the idea behind this crazy looking play, and is it actually worth doing in practice? Let's start off with the logic behind the play. The main advantage of jamming Queen Jack is that it folds out combos that dominate us, such as Ace Queen and King Jack. Many of these hands would have called versus a smaller 4-bet, so jamming is the only reliable way to deny their 70% equity share. By taking down the pot pre-flop, we avoid scenarios where we hit a queen or jack on the flop, only to get stacked by top pair with a higher kicker, which is a very real possibility if we just call the 3-bet. Now imagine if we jam a hand like Ace-Jack instead. Many of the hands that fold are now a big underdog against us, so there is more value in calling and keeping them in small blind's range. The times that we flop a jack, we actually want our opponent to have King Jack and Queen Jack. So even though Ace-Jack is a much stronger hand than Queen Jack, the solver doesn't even consider jamming with it. Of course, if folding out better hands was the only reason to jam, we would also be going all in with Queen Jack offsuit and a ton of other trashy hands as well. Which brings us to the second reason: equity when called. The thing about Queen Jack suited is that we are never in really bad shape when called. Well, unless we are unlucky enough to run into a big pair. But even then, our hand's straight and flush possibilities still give us about 20% equity. Against the rest of the calling range, we are in much better shape. 38% equity against jacks, and essentially flipping against 10s and below. In particular, Queen Jack suited does really well against Ace King, with up to 40% equity depending on suits. This last point is really important because Ace King is such a big part of small blind's calling range. You can't really tell from the hand grid, since each box contains a different number of combos. But if we look at this normalized pie chart, we see that Ace King actually makes up 27% of the calling range, and that this number further increases when we take our hand's blockers into account. So as crazy as it sounds, Queen Jack suited is actually one of the best no-pair hands to be jamming as a bluff. There is a small problem, however. We previously saw that a big reason for jamming Queen Jack is to fold out hands that dominate us. But if our jamming range only contains Queen Jack, then Ace Queen and Ace Jack would have a really easy call, which pretty much defeats the purpose of jamming in the first place. The solution to this problem lies in how we play our Ace King. Small blind is unable to call off with Ace Queen because we are also jamming with Ace King at some frequency. To be absolutely clear, I'm not saying that we're jamming Ace King for the sole purpose of folding out Ace Queen and Ace Jack. Instead, Ace King is jamming for its own set of reasons, the main one being equity denial. But a side effect of jamming is that it discourages small blind from calling off with worse ace highs. This is a key characteristic of GTO strategies. Every hand has its best interest in mind, but different hands are also working in harmony to maximize the EV of our range. When we jam Queen Jack and Ace King as a pair, we don't actually care what small blind does with Ace Queen and Ace Jack. If they fold, then it justifies our jam with Queen Jack. If they call, then Queen Jack goes down in EV, but all of this EV is recouped in the form of extra value for Ace King. It's just like when we bet the river with a balanced range of value and bluffs. No matter how our opponent reacts, our range is always guaranteed a minimum amount of EV because any EV lost by one type of hand is simply transferred to the other. Okay, so we jam with Queen Jack suited, mix in a bunch of Ace King, and there is nothing that small blind can do to exploit us. Or is there? Well, if our jamming range consists of only Queen Jack and Ace King, then small blind should just call the jam with any pocket pair. This creates a bit of a problem since a big part of why we jam Ace King in the first place is to force hands like 6s and 7s off their 50% equity share. Which brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, jacks and 10s. By jamming these hands together with ace-king, we put small blind's pocket pairs in a difficult spot. Call it off, and our jacks and 10s generate a ton of value. Fold, and our ace-king denies a ton of equity. At the same time, small blind cannot simply call off with ace-queen and king-queen because of the presence of ace-king in our jamming range. This allows our jacks and 10s to deny some extra equity, which was really the main reason for jamming them in the first place. In a way, these hands are like cogs in a machine. Remove any one of them and the entire strategy falls apart. But together, they help to put a ton of pressure on our opponent, maximizing our EV and minimizing theirs. It should also be mentioned that Queen-Jack is not a critical component of this machine. It's just there to capitalize on folds from hands that dominate us, and our strategy still works whether or not we jam with Queen-Jack itself. For example, if we look at cutoff's response versus a small blind 3-bet, we see that Queen-Jack suited is now a pure call. Small blind is 3-betting a slightly tighter range, so Queen-Jack no longer denies enough equity to justify 4-bet jamming. But apart from that, the rest of the strategy is quite similar. Ace-King and Jacks are still jamming at some frequency for the exact same reasons: to put pressure on lower pocket pairs and deny equity against Ace-Queen and King-Queen. As we go earlier in the positions, our jamming range starts to change more significantly. Most notably, we now jam with Kings instead of Jacks. This looks a little strange at first. Kings isn't that vulnerable of a hand, so why rush to put all the money in? Well, small blind is 3-betting lots of ace-x, all of which have at least 30% equity against kings. So jamming does still deny a fair bit of equity. But more importantly, as small blind's range gets tighter, the hands that we target with the jam also change accordingly. Versus late position, small blind was 3-betting lots of middling pairs like 9s and 10s. By jamming a mix of jacks and ace-king, we force these pairs to either pay us off or forfeit their equity against ace-king. Against UTG, however, small blind's 3-betting range is more concentrated around bigger pairs like queens and jacks. So if we want to make these hands indifferent, we need to be jamming with a bigger pair as well. The trick is to identify the worst pair that your opponent is 3-betting for value, and then jam the pair that is a few ranks above it. As for whether or not to do it in practice, let's just say that there's very little reason not to. The jamming range is easy to construct, and because we are going all in pre, there's no chance of making post-flop mistakes. It also works especially well against aggressive 3-betters due to the increased amount of air in their range. The more suited connectors and gappers someone is 3-betting, the more equity we deny when we jam our ace-king. And this can turn a slightly winning play into a hugely profitable one.